Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eric. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, cool. And as I said moments ago, you could actually, well, I'm about to switch this slide, so if you didn't get it, you're screwed. But you could actually shoot that, and that's the bit.ly as well, POA for Planet of API and _UXB for the conference. So thank you for having me. My name's Henri. Yes, I am French as in mother tongue. And that is my Twitter handle if you want to send me some praise or anything otherwise. I do like to talk about performance, and listening to the talk earlier, man, I was regaling because that was a lot of fun to hear conversation about things that I like to talk about. Images, I could talk about that all day. If you have questions about images, come see me afterwards. Same with the H2 conversation. I think someone asked about the H2 bit. Boom. Yeah, I got you. Multiplexing, we could talk about that as well. First of all, a lot of people do ask me whether or not that's my real name. It's absolutely not. It's a Twitter handle that I start to just use at conferences, and people are like, oh, dude, is that your name? And I'm like, no, it's not. They get disappointed, but I just thought it had a kind of a cool ring to it. But if you do Google my real name, you'll actually see that I'm actually deceased, which is totally wild. When I found out, I thought that was weird. So I could actually be Tupac right now. But I am from the city of Toronto, a city that I love so dearly. I'm passionate about a multicultural fabric, and I think Toronto has a lot of that. And that's a shot of one of my favorite festivals, which is Caravana, for anyone who loves the West Indies, which is where I'm from. And as was mentioned prior, I love to talk about performance, so I co-head the Toronto Web Performance group. If you're ever in Toronto and you want to attend a meetup, and I happen to be having one, definitely let me know. I'll have you. It's free, and you could check out the bit.ly there. So we are here. We're here to talk about somewhat some performance, and I love this year's theme, which was the age of immediacy. Is that what it was? I thought that was fantastic, and it got me thinking, because we are talking about not wanting to wait for anything. And if you really think about it, it kind of applies to everyday lives. Like, hands up if you travel. Awesome. Keep your hand up if you have TSA pre-check. You know what that's about. That's not about waiting. It's about like getting there. It's like scan, scan, scan. I'm past this line. I remember a while back I'd heard that McDonald's did not want to, well, for a while in Toronto anyways, or Canada, they wouldn't take credit cards because the processing was a little too long. They wanted that cash to be, that cash transaction, and it was like boom, boom, boom. It was about not waiting. Same with who's ever ordered done the Starbucks mobile order. You know, walking in, you grab your cup and you're out while people are still in line. That's all about the immediacy. And because that really got me thinking, and this is also what we apply to the web. So when we talk about immediacy on the web, you cannot talk about immediacy without talking about media. It is part of it. We talk about loading resources, we talk about loading images, we talk about loading JavaScript, and we are trying as much as possible to reduce that friction. And images is part of that conversation. Again, I could just make this entire talk about images, because I think it's incredible what has happened on that level as well. So with that being said, you know, if we keep going and talking about the age of immediacy, there's some other areas of the web that tend to provide a little bit of friction. And you know, it's the other C word, as I like to say, and that is latency. Latency is a big problem on the web as well. As a famous web developer once said, it's the latency, stupid. That was a bad joke, sorry. Latency is very important. A while back, there was a study by a Google developer a long time ago, Mike Belshie, and people like to say, oh, bandwidth, 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 but really latency is one of the biggest problems on the web as well, and we're going to talk about how we can sort of address some of those issues. So that being said, welcome to my talk. It's called Planet of the APIs, a tale of performance and user experience. As you can tell, I'm a bit of a movie buff a bit. right? And, but yeah, we're going to talk about, I have a lot of respect for browsers, browser vendors, and everything that they're doing to make sure that the experience for users is as friction-free as possible. And there's a lot of work being done. And so this is a bit of an ode to some of their work. Now, in case you didn't know, the web turned sort of 30 this year, and I think that's a lot. It's a big deal, and it's been around for a little while. And prior to that, last year, one of the first web browsers turned 25. And that was, yeah, for anyone who remembers this, whoever does, I just heard you, and it's like, shout out, Mosaic. And, you know, when this was being sort of developed by part-time employee who was a student, he had said something to this effect: "This software is going to change everything." Mark Andreessen, obviously, and you'll be able to watch the YouTube. And I think that was a bit of an understatement, ultimately. Even further, another influential person in the web, Kim Polisi, you'll be able to see as well. She mentioned that for me, things started exploding on the web, specifically with the invention of the browser Mosaic, because suddenly the internet was accessible to the average person. And we're going to talk about this statement right here, specifically, the internet being accessible to the average person. I'll say half truth, not so much false, but you know, I mean, there are some details that we'd love to, we're going to explore. But what was really interesting is that there was a massive rush, 65 million new users in 18 months. It was incredible. It was nothing anyone had ever seen at the time. And the reason why I mention this is the following, because right now, 2019 really, but we have 4 billion users online, and we're trying to get a lot more. And this is happening specifically via one client in particular, and this is going to be sort of the overarching conversation that we're going to have, is the mobile device. I don't think that this is something that I don't think anyone had predicted, where in 2019 you're going to run into people who are experiencing the web on one client only. They are being introduced to the web on one client only. This is, you know, they're going to go back, say, 10, 15, 20 years from today and say, you know, I remember when I got my first cell device and I was able to access the web. Whereas most of us were like, oh man, I was on this clunky laptop, and now I guess I just have my phone with me all the time. But for other people, this is not the case. This is what they're experiencing. And it's important because in November 2016, I like to remind people that this is the first day that the world experienced this one sort of like tick in time, and it's the fact that mobile and tablet internet usage exceeded the desktop for the first time worldwide. And this is the kind of data that, you know, looking back, you know, this is not going to tick back to what it used to be ever again. Like, you're not going to have an opportunity where it's like, okay, you know what, I'm not going to use my mobile device anymore, I'm going to go back to my desktop. This is it. You know, like, we've sort of reached this threshold, and we're just going to keep going and going. So we talk about, on the performance side, mobile devices, and we talk about the network. And those are the two sort of like limiting reagents that we deal with all the time. Any chemistry people here? Because I just said some chemistry stuff right there, limiting reagents, my man. So, and as we keep going, and why we talk about this as well is the idea that we have a worldwide audience. Yes, we are in Vermont, you know, we're in North America and whatnot. But if you start to look at the data, where the next users are, and this is very important, you know. I don't know if anyone knows that Google has this team called NBU team, which is the next billion users. They are planning to work with the next users, and they are mostly not in North America. So if you look at some of this data right here, mobile versus desktop, you see exactly where the trend is going. And this is some of the data that you'll be able to refer back to in the link. But you see where the explosion is. It's Africa, well, all the APAC, you know, Brazil. You'll see that some of the major companies that we know, Where are they doing their testing? They're doing testing in Mexico. They're doing testing in India. They're doing testing in parts of Africa because they realize this is where the next user is, and they want to be acclimated with their conditions, how they operate on a daily basis. I love this photo right here. This is a community that, for the most part, has shunned technology at every opportunity, but they are on a mobile device, you know. And if this does not give you an indication of where things are going, maybe nothing will. But yeah, this is very telling. And for the most part as well, you know, we can't really make out what model device she's on, but there's a good chance it's probably moderate to low specs. I don't think I have the slide in this deck right here, but the 3 top countries for sort of like low spec devices, number 1 is India, number 3 is Russia, number 2 is America, the USA. We may be exposed to iPhone X's and S8s and S9s and S10s and whatnot, but for the most part, the majority of sales are not very high-end devices. So these are things that you want to keep in mind in terms of the capability of the device, from the CPU, from storage. These things are very important because there's, again, it's a separate conversation, but there's data out there that people will potentially not download certain resources, not to eat up data, not to eat up space on their phones, etc. Now, I talked about the connectivity as well. This is, again, something that we talk about all the time. Yes, we do have 4G, but I quite often mention to people, you know what? 4G at 2 bars or 3G at 3 bars, which is better? You figure it out. But this is something that is very real, whereas, you know, we might be in a major metro area, but the minute you start to step out on the outskirts, you start to have challenges on the network level. So these are things that browser engineers have to take in all the time. You know, they add features to browsers to try to sort of, what we like to call also sort of like these interventions and hints to try to make things as friction-free as possible for the users. This actually I ran into, and sorry about the massive change in contrast there, you know, you didn't just go blind. I found this week actually, and this is a map of estimates of patients, the patients of users around the world. And, you know, I was like, this is kind of a weird study, but, you know, how weirder would it be if you start to overlay network connectivity to this map? All right, so I don't know if this laser thing is going to work. So, you know, network connectivity might be decent here, might be decent there, but we know it's not awesome here. And apparently everyone here is not very patient. We know it's not awesome out here, but we know one thing for sure, network connectivity is not amazing either. And same with some of these other territories where you know the connectivity, again, is not gangster, but and apparently they're not patient either. Is there a connection? We're not sure, but these are things that we think about. This is actually a podcast that I was listening to a while back, and they talk about how people, you know, that are again, on the outskirts of major cities, and there was an example in London, whereas, you know, the internet connection is so bad, they have to create their own sort of cooperatives to try to get some data out there. And again, these are things that we think about when we're sort of like developing, I mean, the browser people are thinking about when they're adding features to adding features, period. Now, I talk about resources, and I do this also to remind people of what is actually out there on the web, because we may not be able to notice these things when we're on our devices. But, you know, JavaScript, obviously a bit of a challenge out there. But you can see that on a desktop and mobile level, you know, they're almost being sent down the wire at the same rate. And that should not be the case when you're dealing from a desktop to a mobile device. As well, image bytes being sent down the pipe at the same rate. You know, even though they may have lesser requests, but on a per request average, we're getting about the same data. So we have to work with this as much as possible. This is from a 2 or 3 year old study, but this is one that essentially reminds everyone of what exactly is going on. 53% of visitors will abandon a page that takes 3 seconds or more to load. Now that is on a mobile device, and that's pretty much at a 3G connection. Now, even crazier is that 77% of pages load in 10 seconds or more, with the average page loading in 19 seconds. All right, this is actually real data. Again, the same sort of like mobile and 3G level. Now, you might think that 19 seconds, 19 seconds could pass by fairly quickly, even though it's actually not that quick. But let's see how quick that actually is. So some of you may remember this stunning, as they called it, 19-second handshake that took place between the Prime Minister of Japan and someone else here. There's no sound, we don't need it, because this was actually so nutso. Boom. All right? That really happened, and that was 19 seconds. So as funny as that was, these are things, imagine just being on your device, just waiting for the information to come down the pipe, and you probably would have been long gone thereafter. So these are things that, again, the engineers think about with respect to some of these resources that are coming down the pipe. What are we doing to try to help out the situation? What are we doing to try to create a better user experience? I like to say something like this: resource loading is a delicate dance that can be delightful, but also destructive due to device damper and limitations. So with that being said, we talk about making sure that you do some measurements. You cannot improve what you cannot measure. Now, I don't know how many runners are here, but I'm a 5K runner. I could not imagine running without my watch, because even though I know I'm going to finish the race, I want to know what time I got there. We know a page is going to load, but if you're not making any measurements and you don't know how quickly the load took place, you're not in a position to make any kind of improvements to your site. So measurements are very important. Who here remembers Firebug? All right, a few of you. Well, Joe Hewitt started Firebug for one thing only. Well, actually 2 things. Measurements pre and post load, because he knew exactly that he had to figure out what was going on time-wise, and that started to sort of like lay out a landscape of where he can make improvements in his code base. So performance APIs are the browser's solution to real-world measurements. These APIs are going to be out there to help you make the proper measurements that you need to make some improvements. And with that being said, we're going to look at a few. And the key about some of these metrics that we're going to look at, they're going to be perfect so that you can essentially measure yourself against potentially a competitor, or knowing that you want that particular threshold because you don't want anything important loading past this 3-second timeline that we know is where you'll get this bounce rate. Now, this room went from being really hot to now sort of like on the coolish side, and now I wish I had my jacket. But I just had to throw that in. So, load is not a single moment in time. It's an experience that no one metric can fully capture. So, we are going to look again at some metrics, but depending on what your site needs are, you may want to say, okay, you know what? I'd like this metric to be around this level because I needed to do this. Or someone else might say, hey, the most important metric on my page is going to be this because this is what the user needs to sort of interact with. So we're going to take a look at some of these metrics right now. So one of my favorite ones, and let me know if you're familiar with this, and has anyone come across the paint timing API? Okay, we have one person, awesome. I will take my jacket right now, actually, if that's cool with you, because I'm starting to freeze, I'm sorry. Thank you so much, appreciate it. So the paint timing API is one of my faves. It does provide a lot of information, and we're going to sort of like see that near the end of this talk as well. So paint timing API in our case, we're gonna look at 3 things. First paint, first contentful paint, and first meaningful paint. Now, the first paint is the following. It reports the time when the browser first renders, basically after navigation. So essentially, it's going to measure when we paint literally the first speckle of anything onto the screen. Because as you know, when a page is being rendered onto the viewport, it's like colors start to come in, fonts and whatnot, but the first paint is basically the first piece of speckle. Now, what will be a bit more important, okay, and this is actually a sort of like a visual representation of that. So your first paint is probably going to take place somewhere around here. Now, the problem is that you may get actually white paint being painted here. So sometimes you will get some of these figures that it's like, okay, my first paint is here, but I don't see anything. But basically what happened, it was like white on white that took place. Now, first contentful paint is the one that you want to pay the most attention to, and I'll tell you why right here. It's basically when it reports when the browser first rendered any text or images. So what is that going to mean? That means that when a user sees an image or text come in, you can then assume that they realize now this is where the information that I'm requesting is starting to being rendered to the page, and that's one of the keyest moments right there. So FCP is something that you probably want to keep in mind most of the time. Further to that, you're going to have also this thing called the first meaningful paint. That gets a little bit more complicated, and this is probably used a little less, but it's still obviously available, and I'm going to talk about that because you're going to see it in a following slide. But like I said, this is one that you don't want to pay too much attention to. Now, what's going to happen, and this is in Chrome right now, but I mean, we're going to talk about compatibility, is that you'll be able to get some of the information simply through some JavaScript. You can see the start time right here of your first paint, and you could actually see the start time here of the first contentful paint. Now, quite often, and this is the UXB site, hey, okay, and quite often they could actually be the same, which is there's no problem with them being as such, but it gives you an idea of when some contentful, I'll even say meaningful information is coming into the page. So right here you have something coming in within 1.5 seconds, pretty good. Now, since we are at a UX conference, I know this looks a little scary, but you can actually go into DevTools and have a visual representation of where it comes in. So right here, I'm actually going to do that. You can see first paint, FP, first contentful paint, FCP. First meaningful paint is here as well, so don't worry about that. But this is where actually you can have an idea of what's happening visually. And in fact, and you can't really tell here, but there's a dotted line that gives you an idea of timeline of what's happening right there. So you can actually have a visual representation of what's happening with the paint timing, which is great. So again, you have a good idea of where along the line the information is coming through. Now, this is going to be a representation, and again, on a mobile level, of where you get support for this. So obviously you have Chrome. Coming is on Firefox. I believe it's in Nightly, but I have to double check. It's not on Safari. But then you have Opera, you have Samsung Internet. To be considered, because Samsung do have a lot of product out there. You have Edge and you have Android default browser. Now, Edge, as some of you may or may not realize, but Edge is now based on Chromium, which means that anything that Chrome does, Edge will do, pretty much. So you're going to now have what may have been, some may say, problematic in the past with Microsoft and their sort of support. It's literally going to be a complete 180 now. And you're going to have that kind of support from the people at MS. So that was the paint timing API. Now, intersection observer. Yes, you have a question? Or?
Yeah, question. You know why Firefox?
Well, Firefox are on the way. So basically, and I was like digging through because I'm pretty sure it's possibly Nightly right now, which is like their canary. But I know for a fact that is just coming down the pipe. You're most welcome. And I'm actually, after this, I'm actually going to shoot a little message to one of the engineers there to make sure that I'm not, misrepresenting them. Intersection observer. Who's familiar with that right there? Okay, amazing. We have one person in the room. Awesome. So I like to call this almost like this weird sort of like native lazy loading without it actually being lazy loading. So essentially with that, what you're going to get is, let me see my next slide, bam, there we go. The Intersection Observer API enables developers to understand the visibility position of target DOM elements relative to an intersection route. So I'm going to play this animation real quickly that has no sound, so don't worry. So ultimately what happens there is you can actually set up an element so that when it comes to a particular point in the viewport, it'll just load up. All right, so that's being used for a lot of different reasons, but one of them was certainly almost like fake lazy loading of images. Because again, images, we talk about them being like pretty important in the sort of like user experience thing from a data consumption level and load time. So is this going to work? Let's go, this is an example, and I'll have a link. Oh, did I cover my mic? Oh, my bad, sorry guys. So. So when you play back the video, it's like Charlie Brown, a bunch of muffling. Intersection observer. So I don't know if you saw what happened right there. So let me go back and play it again. Okay, perfect. So here you can see where suddenly some images are going to pop up, and you can't really tell right here, but there's an actual count of the images right there. It's almost like a native lazy loading, but that's going to be used not only for images, but they're talking about using it for like advertising to understand potentially where, if a user saw it, how much of the advert that they saw, things like that. So. It's very a simplified explanation, but this is another API, again, that was being used prior, more on an image level. I have a conversation about that a little later as well. But can be used right now, and in fact, this is some of your support right here, okay? And again, I'm throwing this up simply because once you start to add up the usage worldwide of some of these clients, you're probably around that 70, 75, sometimes 80% level. So these are things that you can use today to make sure that your users are having the best experience possible. Media capabilities API, and this is something I kind of like on a nerdy level, maybe not the greatest use, but what happens here is you'll be able to query the agent and to sort of understand what the decoding and encoding abilities of the device have. Now, there is a bit of a challenge with some decoding, especially on the media level, images as well. And again, since this has been around in the last 3 or 4 months, there have been some updates. But this is something, again, that you'll be able to use. And depending on the device that the user is using, you might be able to send a particular format down. Now, Facebook has this thing that's very interesting called the, let me think about it, it's called the, I was talking about it this morning. Year class, that's it. Something that's happening today. Now, I talked earlier about, we might have iPhone X's and, the high-end devices, but there are quite a few lower-end devices in the market being sold. Now, what's happening for certain markets, you may get a new phone, a 2019 device, you go walk in, might be Samsung or whatnot, but it has 2015 specs, all right? And this is something that's happening. It's certainly in markets outside of, say, like the major metropolitans, and definitely in other territories, emerging markets. And it's a situation that became about, that they understood later on. So now what they're doing is they have this sort of SDK where essentially you can sort of gauge essentially the media capabilities of a particular device and send assets accordingly. And these are examples that I left links in the deck that you'll have, but you'll be able to see that you'll be able to sort of like pull the device and figure out what it is that's it's best suited for and send the appropriate file down. And again, here you have some of the support. And again, Chrome being there, Firefox being there, and then again, you have Edge, you have Android, and Opera. Now, I know I talked about this API earlier, but this is certainly a very powerful and one of my favorites here. So the Network Information API, hand up if you've ever come across that at all. Perfect. So I'm going to say anything and no one knows if I'm telling the truth. This is really awesome though. The Network Information API enables web applications to access information about the network connection in use by the device. So it's essentially going to pull your network and figure out, like, are you having probably a degraded experience because you're on 3G? What is the round trip times that you're experiencing right now? What about the bandwidth? How's your bandwidth right now? So we'll be able to sort of figure that out, and in the following way. So you'll be able to check the downlink. So the downlink will tell you whether or not, like, you're experiencing like comfortable 10 megabit speeds or 8, 5, whatever it is. So you can essentially start to get an idea of what the user is experiencing as we speak. Effective type, same deal. Now, are you going to be, what kind of connection do you have? Is it 4G? Is it 3G? Is it 2G? Is it slow 2G? So something like this might come around and say, and as I talked about earlier, latency is very important. So I might say, like, okay, I find out that you're on 3G. So instead of sending a retina image down, I might send you, I don't know, something black and white that's not retina, or an illustration instead of an actual photo. Now, if you're on slow 2G, I may not send you a picture at all. I might just give you the text because I realize you're probably not going to be able to download this in any kind of decent time. And again, you'll be able to pull the round trip times. Is it like 0, more or less, which is not really going to happen, but especially not on mobile. But are you having some very high round trip times? And these are things that are happening in certain territories, and or you might be at, I think there's a festival, a music festival here tomorrow or something like that, or tonight. And I don't know about you guys, but you know, sometimes you're at festivals and you know, you're trying to send that photo to a friend of yours, nothing's going through. The round trip times are crazy because there's 500 people per tower out of nowhere. These are things that you'll be able to pull. And the save data header, very important, because in certain cases, a client might say, or user might say, you know what, I'm turning my save data on, which is indicating to us, it's like, oh, they don't want any high-end media. They don't want heavy pages. So I make some of these adjustments from my end saying, okay, I have this other photo I'm going to send you, or maybe I'm not going to send it to you at all. All right? So that's what the Network Information API is going to be able to sort of pull and sort of like deliver in terms of information. So as you see right here, again, it's not the awesomest, but that's why I got you guys to download the deck early. You'll be able to see that, okay, and I was sitting in probably a hotel, so it's probably all like amazing data, but like round trip times were approximately 50. My save data header was false, so I was like, send me all the retina images you want, etc. Effective type was 4G. Now again, you'll get that effect, the 4G effective type, you'll get it even as you're on Wi-Fi. It's essentially saying, it's like, hey, this person is experiencing probably decent connections. So you work accordingly. Now, the support is as follows. Nothing, it's across the board, it's good. Nothing outside of Safari. I mean, everything outside of Safari. So this is something that you can use today. Cache API, I'm going to race through this quickly because I don't have too much time. Why do I like that? Why do I like this? Well, I'm traveling, I'm here from Toronto, and I'm on airplane mode. So it's like, how do I get around? Well, I can download things locally like Google Maps, and I can navigate around without using up some data. Now, same goes for maybe some articles. You may be able to, this is what I want to say, going offline. You may be able to essentially create a situation where it's like, okay, boom, you're going to download this one article about like the Mueller report, and we think that these 3 or 4 links are the ones that you're going to go to afterwards. So, bam, you have everything downloaded offline, so you can, with offline capabilities, what I meant. So you can have this, you'll be able to browse this, say, in the subway. And I don't know if there's a subway here, but you know, these opportunities may or may not come up. So, and there's a great example you'll be able to check out, and I left the link there. Jeep had this offline site where, you know, a Jeep client may obviously be going out to the woods, all right? And they give you an opportunity to hit the site. You actually download the, some of the details locally, and then you can head out and offline get some of this information from them, because they realize that their clients are probably going to be like off-roading and doing whatever and pitching their tents and whatnot. And these are little sort of like opportunities to create a better user experience. All right, instead of trying to like, oh man, I'm trying to put this tent up, but I'm trying to look for like a tower. The nearest tower is like hundreds of miles away. So these are opportunities to create a better experience. And again, going offline is one of them for sure. And then the support here, boom, across the board, you're gravy. 35 minutes. Okay, I'm on point, I believe. Battery status API. Now, usually when I talk about this, I'm stricken with Lightning, so be careful. This is actually a deprecated API. But it's one that's actually really interesting, because you'll be able to provide information about the system's battery charge levels, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these things are important because I don't know if about you, but you know, sometimes when you might have like 10% on your phone and then you jump on Instagram because you want to see what's going on and suddenly your phone dies. Well, I mean, there's a chain of events that take place, but you know, image processing is taxing on the CPU. The CPU working is taxing on the battery. All right. So once you start to get some of this information out, it's like, hey, I'm at 20%. Hey, maybe I'm not going to send you again. It's about the asset management. I may not send you some of these files because I know things are not looking good for you on the battery level. Now, there are some other examples that are a little crazy. They're talking about like, well, you know, if Uber finds out that you have low battery and you're probably desperate, you know, reaching out to them, they might give you some of that times 2, times 3 situation going on. It's like, oh, he's desperate. We're going to squeeze him for money, you know. But the fact is that there's still support fairly decently across the board. But, you know, the concern is, you know, the fingerprinting and whatnot. So that's why Safari and Firefox are out. But it's actually, again, it's still in use right now. You can still use it, but they'll tell you it is a deprecated API. Now, with all that being said, and I've thrown a bunch of different APIs at you, you're like, oh my God, what's going on? What can you do with all this? Well, when I flew in yesterday, or I came in yesterday, and I talked about comparing, seeing what competitors are doing, see what other people in your space are doing. So I went and looked at news sites, all right? And I took the first Contentful paint, and I took a look at some of the data. Now, I have it set up here in 200 millisecond bins. So I'm looking at the first 5 seconds of the load of the following sites. All right, so everyone got that? Boom. So this was the Wall Street Journal, and I did the Wall Street Journal because it was those 3 papers in my hotel. So what is this telling us right here? This is saying that the majority, say, of their users are getting, let me see, a decent experience, like the first second and a half, they're getting about like, I don't know, like 30% of their users right here. So essentially with this chart, what you want to see is, you want to see this being front loaded. You want to make sure the users are getting some painting happening as quickly as possible. Now that was Wall Street Journal. This is the Burlington Free Press. Okay, I don't know if anyone from that company's here. I'm not calling you out. I'm just like seeing what's happening right here. So here you can see that they're probably getting a few less people at the same level. It's not too bad. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2.5, yeah, okay. But you can see there's a long tail here because there are some people that are still experiencing something around the 5-second level. This is the USA Today. All right, so you start to compare yourself to others to see if they're faster and whatnot, and trying to understand where you can make some improvements. And then I'm not sure what this is, but I just found it online. And
the paper, it's like an arts and journalism paper. It comes out every week for free.
Boom, there you go. Well, you know, some of their greatest, some of the most painting is happening around 1.8, 2 seconds. So they don't have a lot of time left if we're talking about that 3-second threshold. And really, where they should be getting a lot of action, like you're not seeing, enough action in that sort of like 1 second and prior. So these are things that you start to look at and understand. It's like, okay, guys, team, we need to make some improvements. So we want to make sure that from 0 to 1.5, we get as many people there as possible. If that makes sense. Yeah? And if it didn't, we can sort of talk about that afterwards. So there are some other areas that I didn't mention because there are so many, but I'm going to list them right here. In between me starting this talk and today, and probably in the next month or so, you're going to actually get true lazy loading, image lazy loading in, for sure, Chrome, because I think that's going to hit Canary within the next couple weeks, I believe. So look out for that. There's some other things because we talk about hints and interventions. Browser engineers talk about these interventions because they realize they have to come in and sort of potentially save the users from some of these challenges. They're talking about when a user is in 2G space, they might start to do things like cap the JavaScript that's being sent down the wire because they realize this is probably not the climate for all this JavaScript to go down. They talk about things like heavy page capping. And they actually had it in experiment for a while and they pulled it because they want to change the UI. But they realize a lot of pages are coming in at 4 or 5 megs or more. So they're going to have these interventions where if it surpasses 2 megs, you're going to get this little warning, X, Y, and Z. Things like, image decoding. I mentioned that was a bit of a tax on the CPU, and you're going to be able to sort of control that decoding and defer it depending on what image it is, how important it is to your user or your document. So these are kind of things that are taking place in terms of hints and interventions. So that being said, some of these APIs that are available to you right now, I think are going to be perfect in terms of creating a better user experience for some better UX for the users that are coming in for various sites, whether it be marketing sites, microsites, etc. And they're going to, enable this sort of 3 seconds or less priority that we have in terms of trying to make sure that the user's attention is captured. Earlier today, it was Victor, right? Victor, he talked about that 50 milliseconds, which is extremely fast, but the fact is there is a sort of sense of immediacy when you are surfing the web right now, and we try to sort of look after that as much as possible. And with that being said, thank you very much. If you have any questions, definitely let me know. I know it's a lot to take in.